I said my name is Christos Passas, and I'm the project director for Zaha Hadid's project in Cyprus. And I would like to offer a kind of an alternative perspective on issues of cultural identity maybe today. And instead of looking at cultural identity from the lens of, or the historical lens, or the lens of historical evolution, perhaps to remove a little bit from the emotional attachment to these issues, perhaps we can look at it from an anthropological issue from a minute. And it's interesting to observe, maybe, that indigenous Cypriot identity through the ages, starting from 2,500 years BC, maybe even earlier, started by always the subjection of Cypriot indigenous peoples to foreign rule. This didn't happen only, let's say, recently from the Ottoman Empire onwards, but it's been happening since the Phoenicians. And that is because Cyprus is a small island, it has some resources that are generally considered useful, etc. But there are some interesting landmarks or highlights in this kind of 3,000-year-old history. First of all is, of course, the Phoenicians and the alphabet. Then it's the Greek colonization and Christianity through the extension of the Byzantine era. And the Ottoman times, which is a kind of, if you like, a continuation of the Byzantine governance, but under a different religious regime. And the British colonial times, which is a fairly short period of time in this history, where there was a sensation that the system of governance that was trying to be implemented on the island was coming from the outside by that time, rather than by belonging to it. Perhaps because British and Cypriot identities were remotely different. But through all of these things, I think the common undercurrent is that there is a process of realizing a potential for self-determination, and that against the kind of principles of state organization. And I think as a Cypriot, our identity has always been changing. So I find reluctance in myself to admit that we have one static identity, because our identity has been changing through the ages. Of course, there is common things, but also there are things that are changing either from external factors or maybe factors of just pure social evolution. And this issue of self-determination and state organization is something that concerns me quite a lot, because one is an opposite force to the other almost. It's like with state organization, you try to bring things together, and with self-determination, the kind of puzzle breaks apart and it becomes a kind of set of elements. And I think what can unify these two worlds is a vision to the future. In other words, not only wondering what we were, where we have been and all that, but where you want to get. Ulysses in the Odyssey had a vision of wanting to go back to Penelope for 10 years. So wherever he stopped in his in-between trip, it was part of the process of realization of this aspect. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that I belong in a generation who were roughly 3 years old when the Turkish invasion happened. And kids at that time, from a kind of pedagogical or human evolution point of view, learn to understand what is theirs. They have their own toys, they have their own houses, they have their own mommy, they have their own. In other words, they begin to develop their sense of self through ownership of things. And we lost that, because the first memories we have was that of loss. For whichever reason, I'm not being critical about the politics or whatever, there is views pro and against for all of these things, but for a long time this thing tormented us. My brother, my friends, we talked about it very much, but never on a kind of serious level. And recently we had the chance to visit Famagusta and to do an architectural workshop there, and suddenly I came to the realization that we may have been in pain for what happened in 1974, but in fact I'm beginning to realize that if and I can't speak for everybody, but if I am to liberate myself from this pain, I need to look at it in a different way. I need to realize that maybe the fact that we lost this sense of home and we became effectively homeless through that time, maybe it liberated us rather than enslaved us in a particular point in history that we can never get over, you know? And since that time, I've traveled the world. I've been in many countries and worked in many countries. I met people like Zaha Hadid. I met people like Raymond Abraham. I met a whole spectrum of people who are exceptional in their own field, in their own way. And I try to make my home where I am. It's a little bit maybe more a kind of hippie idea, but it's a kind of liberating to feel free and to feel part of the world than feeling stuck that you belong in a particular group that is a kind of closed and static, let's say, set of values. I think, having said all these things, the Cypriot identity, and I'm going to go back to what I was saying before, is changing. It's changing all the time. It's changing. It changed when the Lebanese refugees came to Cyprus, and in Limassol, for example, all the signs of the shop changed overnight from English to Arabic. They changed when the Russians came to Cyprus, and all the Arabic signs were replaced by Russian signs. But what I'm trying to say is that through that is where we learn for what the world around us is. And we are lucky enough not to go out, like in the British colonial times, to discover the world. We have the luxury of having the world come to us to tell us what's going on. And we learned from that. I had a Swedish girlfriend when I was 18. It was, you know, incredible. Two different worlds, for example. Okay? But I'm giving you both social examples and personal examples to tell you that, to prove, rather, that these worlds meet somewhere. It happened, and it happened like that. It wasn't in my control, and clearly when I was 18, I didn't have the perspective I have today. So, this idea of becoming a citizen of the world, I think, or a state in the world, is interesting for Cyprus. It's interesting for Cyprus because the only way to achieve this participation to the world system, we need to figure out how to self-rule. And that was an interesting experiment, I think, with the British colonial times. It didn't go very well because fundamentally, is my opinion, the Cypriots were not ready for that kind of thing. States, to develop into a state of independence, they go through many social revolutions. And we never had the time to catch up. When we were trying to determine and self-rule about what we wanted to be, the whole rest of the world were talking about hippie love and unification and no nuclear weapons, etc. And we were going the opposite way. So I will close with one thing. I believe that this island should unify because only through this way and through the respect of the other we can develop our self-consciousness and this participation in the world. Okay?